The courtroom was silent as the judge called the case. The atmosphere was tense, everyone waiting for what was about to happen. The doors opened, and two police officers walked in, pushing an older, frail man in a wheelchair. His clothes were tattered, his face full of wrinkles, and his eyes seemed lost in thought. He was black, with gray hair peeking out from under a faded hat. The man didn't speak as he was brought to the front of the courtroom, but there was something in his eyes, something that made every person in the room feel like they were staring at history itself. The room was filled with people, lawyers, witnesses, and a handful of spectators, none of them expecting what was about to unfold. As the judge looked down at the man in the wheelchair, he called out his name, James Holloway. The second the judge spoke those words, the entire courtroom rose to its feet. There was a collective gasp, as if a great, unexpected storm had suddenly hit. The room was filled with whispers, and the officers standing next to James quickly looked around, clearly confused by the reaction. The bailiff, who had been waiting patiently by the door, suddenly looked unsure of what was happening. James sat motionless, his eyes closed as if he hadn't heard a thing. The officer standing next to him gently nudged his shoulder. James' eyes flickered open slowly, but he didn't seem to understand why everyone was standing. He looked up at the judge, his face wrinkled with age and confusion. "Your Honor, what is happening?" The officer beside him stammered, as if he had forgotten the proceedings for a moment. The judge, a seasoned man named Judge Thompson, stared at James with a strange look in his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Holloway, it's been a long time. We didn't expect this to happen." The courtroom was still standing, everyone staring at James with a sense of reverence, as if they had just witnessed a man whose name had been written in the very pages of history. But why? What was it about this black homeless veteran that had caused such a reaction? Why had the entire courtroom risen in respect at the mere sound of his name? And what was about to happen next? The whispers grew louder, and the tension in the air was palpable. Just then, a man stood from the back of the courtroom, a lawyer in a sharp suit, his face full of urgency. His voice cut through the room like a knife. "Judge Thompson, we cannot proceed like this," he said, his voice shaking. "This is not just any man. You all need to know who this is before we go any further." And then, the lawyer turned to the audience, his words carrying a weight that could be felt in every corner of the room. "I knew James Holloway. We all did. And you will all learn why today." The courtroom was now in complete chaos. There were murmurs and confused exchanges. The judge banged his gavel, trying to restore order, but nothing could calm the shock that had taken over everyone. And then, a voice from the back shouted out, "Who is he? What's the story? Why are you all acting like this?" The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Who was James Holloway? And what was it about him that had caused such a stirring reaction? Was there something we didn't know? What had James done to earn such a place in history? The answers were coming. But for now, the room was in turmoil, and the eyes of every person in the courtroom were locked on the old man in the wheelchair. The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as everyone waited for the truth to finally be revealed. But before they could hear it, something else happened. A door at the back of the room swung open, and another person walked in. The atmosphere shifted once again. Who was this new arrival? What would they say about James Holloway? And what did the past hold for the man in the wheelchair, who had somehow become the center of all their attention? Would they finally understand the story behind the man that had them all on edge? The room was about to find out. The figure who had entered the room was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hard yet filled with an unmistakable warmth. He wore a suit that matched his stature, dark and polished. As he stepped into the courtroom, his eyes quickly scanned the room. He was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair at his temples, and as soon as his gaze landed on James, something unspoken passed between them. "Is this really happening?" the man muttered to himself, more to his own conscience than anyone else. "Mr. Holloway," the judge said quietly, his voice now softer, almost reverent. "It's been a long time since anyone has seen you, hasn't it?" James' eyes flickered to the man who had just entered, though he didn't seem to recognize him. The old veteran looked confused as he blinked at the newcomer. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or a cough. The man who had entered stood silently at the back, waiting. The officers who had accompanied James seemed increasingly uneasy, their hands twitching as if unsure of how to handle the situation. Finally, The man stepped forward. Your Honor, I need to speak with Mr. Holloway. The judge looked up at him, his expression unreadable. You're welcome to address the court. The man took a deep breath and walked slowly toward James, his every step measured. He reached the old man's side, his hands resting gently on the back of James' wheelchair. There was a deep, palpable connection between them, something the entire courtroom felt. And then the man bent down, his voice low but steady as he spoke to James. James, it's me. It's Lieutenant Daniel Calloway. The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and there was a sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Lieutenant Calloway? The room seemed to pause, the name igniting a spark in the crowd. Some people started whispering, murmurs rising like a tide. James' face changed then. His eyes softened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. It was brief, but it was there. Daniel? James asked, his voice cracking slightly. The words were shaky, uncertain, as though he were trying to bring something from a far-off memory into focus. Yes, it's me, James, Lieutenant Calloway said, his voice filled with both relief and sorrow. You were a hero, James. You still are. At those words, the courtroom seemed to freeze. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. A hero? Everyone knew that James Holloway had been homeless for years. He'd been living on the streets, forgotten by most. How could someone like him be a hero? How could a man who had spent years in the shadows of society possibly be deserving of such a title? The judge stood up, his gavel in hand, as though unsure of what to do. But Lieutenant Calloway didn't wait for permission. He looked up at the judge, his expression serious and unwavering. Your Honor, I ask that you allow me to speak freely. This man, this veteran, deserves to be remembered for what he truly is, not for the situation he finds himself in now. The judge paused. His eyes flicked back to James, and for a moment, he seemed to struggle with something deep inside. It was clear now that he knew there was a bigger story at play, something far beyond what had brought James to this courtroom. Proceed, Lieutenant, the judge finally said, his voice steady, but filled with an underlying sense of respect. And so, Lieutenant Calloway began to speak. James Holloway was more than just a soldier, he started, his voice echoing in the room. He was a leader. He was a man who saved lives in the dead of night during one of the most dangerous operations I've ever been a part of. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think of himself. James saved dozens of men, including me, when we were trapped during the battle in Fallujah. A hush fell over the room. The name Fallujah hung in the air, reminding everyone of the horrors of war. People started shifting in their seats, glancing at each other as though they were suddenly seeing James in a different light. James, Lieutenant Calloway continued. He stayed behind to cover us. He refused to leave his post, knowing full well that he was putting himself in grave danger. We thought he was lost. We thought we had lost him that day. The room seemed to hold its breath. But he made it out, Calloway said, his voice breaking. He made it out, and he carried the weight of that day with him ever since. And yet, he's been forgotten. Forgotten by the people who should have remembered him the most. James' eyes, which had been glazed over, now seemed to sharpen. He looked up at Calloway, as if seeing him for the first time in years. The realization hit him slowly, like a wave crashing onto the shore. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of the wheelchair, trying to steady himself. I never wanted anyone to remember that day, James whispered hoarsely, his voice filled with shame. I didn't want anyone to know. But why, James? Calloway asked softly, his voice filled with both concern and frustration. You gave everything. You are a hero. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. No one dared to make a sound. But there was something in the air now, something heavier than just curiosity. It was as if the room could feel the weight of James' past, of everything he had gone through. James, Calloway repeated, his voice full of compassion. You're not a forgotten man. Not anymore. For a long moment, James said nothing. His eyes were distant, lost in memories that no one else in the room could understand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. I didn't want to be remembered for that. I didn't want anyone to know. But, his voice faltered. I just wanted to survive. To make it out alive. As the room absorbed his words, there was a shift in the air. The shock from the earlier revelation still hung in the room. But now, something else was unfolding. The courtroom was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a man who had been forgotten. This was about a man who had lived through unimaginable hardship, and somehow, he was still here. But just as the room began to absorb this new truth, a door at the back of the room slammed open, and another figure entered. His presence was commanding, and everyone turned to look, a sense of unease filling the air. Who was this new person, and what did they know about James Holloway's past? Why had they arrived just as the truth was beginning to surface? The courtroom was about to face yet another twist. The new figure who entered the courtroom moved swiftly, a tall man with a sharp jawline and a deep frown etched across his face. He was dressed in a suit, though it wasn't as polished as Lieutenant Calloway's. His presence was commanding, yet there was a sense of urgency in the way he carried himself, as if he had just walked into something he hadn't expected but needed to address immediately. His eyes locked onto James Holloway, and without hesitation, he stepped toward the front of the room. The murmurs grew louder, as people began whispering to each other, trying to figure out who this man was. The tension in the room, already thick, felt like it could snap at any moment. "Who is this?" one of the spectators whispered, nudging the person next to them. The man's sharp gaze swept over the room, then settled on Lieutenant Calloway. His voice rang out, firm and commanding, as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you immediately. This is about Mr. Holloway." The judge, still in a state of confusion from the sudden arrival, raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" The man didn't flinch at the judge's gaze. "I'm Special Agent Nathan Turner. I'm here to discuss the matter of James Holloway's military service." He turned to face the courtroom, his tone now filled with weight. "And more specifically, I'm here to discuss the secret that has been buried for decades." A shiver ran through the room. Another secret? The whispers intensified, and everyone seemed to hold their breath as Agent Turner's words hung in the air. What did he mean by a secret? And why was it coming out now? Lieutenant Calloway, his posture rigid, seemed to tense up at the mention of his secret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Agent Turner raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, Lieutenant," Turner said sharply. "This is not your story to tell." The room was silent now, hanging on every word that came next. Agent Turner's eyes locked with James Holloway, his gaze hardening. "Mr. Holloway," he said with quiet authority, "you've spent a long time hiding the truth. But it's time for that to change. You can't run from it anymore." James looked up, a flicker of fear flashing across his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted from Lieutenant Calloway to Agent Turner, then to the judge. There was a sense of panic that began to creep into his features, as though he understood the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Agent Turner, I don't know what you're talking about," James finally managed, his voice shaking slightly. But Agent Turner wasn't backing down. "Yes, you do, James. And it's time the world knows what you did. What you were forced to do." The room was now filled with confusion and curiosity. People were leaning forward in their seats, trying to hear every word. What could James have done that had been hidden for so long? And why was Agent Turner so insistent on bringing it out now? "You've kept it quiet for decades," Turner continued, his voice filled with a deep intensity. "You've buried the truth about your actions during that mission in Fallujah. But the time has come for the world to know, for everyone to understand who you really are." James was visibly shaking now, his eyes wide with fear. He glanced at Calloway, then back at Turner. There was something in his gaze, something that suggested he was trying to process the reality of what was being said. The judge, still standing at the bench, banged his gavel. "Enough. Mr. Turner, if you have something to say, then say it. But we will not tolerate these interruptions any longer." Agent Turner nodded, his face grim. "Very well, Your Honor. James Holloway, this man, this hero, was part of a mission that went deeper than any of us could have known at the time. You see, what James did on that day in Fallujah wasn't just about saving lives. It wasn't just about bravery. It was about something darker, something that has haunted him for years." The room was on edge. The tension was so thick that it seemed to suffocate the air. Everyone was waiting for the next words out of Agent Turner's mouth. But no one was prepared for what came next. "You see," Turner continued, "James Holloway, along with several others, was part of a covert operation. An operation that, to this day, the public knows nothing about. An operation that was ordered by the highest levels of the government, something that no one has dared to speak of. But James was the one who had to make the call, the one who had to decide who lived and who died. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. James' eyes widened in disbelief. He was visibly trembling now, his lips parted in shock. This was something he had buried deep within himself, something he had never wanted anyone to know. James, you were part of the operation that took out an entire civilian village, Agent Turner said, his voice cold and steady. You were the one who gave the order. And now, all these years later, the truth is coming out. The room exploded into chaos. Some people stood, others gasped, and a few started shouting. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but no one seemed to care. The bombshell that Agent Turner had just dropped was too much. Too shocking. Too overwhelming. You lied to everyone, someone shouted from the back of the room. How could you do that? Another voice called out. James' face was now a mixture of fear and sorrow. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking violently. The weight of the past was too much to bear. How could he have carried this secret for so long? How could he have kept this truth hidden from the world? Lieutenant Calloway stepped forward, his face a mask of both sympathy and anger. James didn't make that decision lightly, he said, his voice rising to be heard above the chaos. He was forced into a corner. He had no choice. The orders came from the top, but no one was listening. The room was still in an uproar, the accusations flying, the whispers of betrayal and dishonor filling the air. And then, as the judge tried desperately to restore order, a voice cut through the noise, a voice that was calm, clear, and filled with authority. It was the voice of James Holloway. I didn't want to make that choice, James said, his voice breaking. I didn't want to be part of that, but I had no choice. The courtroom went silent again, the truth hanging in the air. The weight of what had just been revealed was almost too much for anyone to bear. But there was one thing that everyone could see now. James Holloway was not just a homeless man. He wasn't just a veteran forgotten by society. He was a man carrying the burden of a choice that no one could fully understand. But the question remained, what would happen now? What would the court decide? Would James finally find the justice he deserved? Or would the burden of his past haunt him forever? The answers were just beginning to unfold. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It was as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the truth that had just been exposed. James Holloway, once just a forgotten homeless veteran, now stood at the center of a storm that no one could have anticipated. His hands trembled in his lap as he stared down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His past, buried for so long, had been dragged out into the light, and the courtroom was reeling from the revelation. Agent Turner stood still, his arms folded, watching James carefully. Lieutenant Calloway, who had stood by James' side for so long, now looked uncertain, his face hard with the knowledge that the man he had called a hero had just been labeled something entirely different. The judge, Judge Thompson, looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of just a few minutes. His gavel lay unused in front of him, his hands clasped tightly together. He seemed torn, as if caught between the justice he had sworn to uphold and the empathy he felt for James. Finally, the silence was broken by a voice from the back of the room. Your Honor, we need to understand the full context of this operation before making any judgments. A man called out from the back, standing up in the gallery. It was a new voice, a lawyer whose face was unfamiliar to most in the room. The judge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Agreed. We cannot proceed without understanding the complete picture. Mr. Turner, can you shed more light on what you're implying about Mr. Holloway's involvement? Agent Turner stepped forward, his face still stern, but now showing a hint of weariness. The operation James was part of was classified. It was designed to eliminate an enemy cell that was orchestrating attacks against our forces. But there was a civilian casualty problem, a significant one. We were told to take out the cell, but when the operation went south, the decision was made to eliminate the entire village to prevent the cell from spreading. James was placed in a position where he had to give the final order. The room was quiet again. The weight of what Turner said was too heavy for anyone to fully grasp. The idea that James, a soldier who had already endured so much, had been forced to make that decision seemed unfathomable to some. But it also made them wonder, how much of this was truly his fault? Was he simply following orders? Was there more to the story? Lieutenant Calloway, visibly disturbed, stepped forward. James didn't make that decision alone, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. None of us did. The orders came from higher up, Command made it clear. It wasn't James' decision to wipe out that village. He had no choice. The courtroom seemed to buzz with conflicting emotions. Some people in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, trying to process what was happening. The truth was murky, and as much as they wanted to blame someone, the reality of war and the choices soldiers had to make in those situations wasn't something anyone in the room could fully comprehend. James, still sitting in his wheelchair, looked up at Calloway with gratitude in his eyes. For the first time since the trial had started, he seemed to relax, just slightly. The man who had stood by his side for all these years, who had fought with him in battle, was still defending him. And James needed that. He needed someone who understood, someone who could vouch for the man he once was, not just the broken figure in front of him now. Judge Thompson, after a long pause, finally spoke again. We cannot proceed with a trial based solely on the circumstances as they've been laid out. There's too much we don't know. We need a full investigation into the operation, into what happened on the ground in Fallujah. We need all the facts before any decisions are made about Mr. Holloway's future. The tension in the room didn't ease immediately, but it was clear that the judge was trying to buy time. Time to piece together what had truly occurred in the chaos of war. And that time was something James desperately needed. The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, and several people began to rise from their seats, clearly preparing to leave. The day was far from over, but it seemed that everyone was beginning to process the gravity of what had been revealed. James' fate now rested on a web of investigation, a truth that could be both freeing and condemning. But as the crowd began to shift, another figure appeared at the back of the courtroom. This person wasn't a lawyer, nor was he an officer or a member of the military. He was someone from James' past, someone who had been a part of the same unit, someone who knew the truth better than anyone else. He was a soldier, and he was here to speak. The new figure, tall with short-cropped hair and a face hardened by years of service, stepped forward. His name was Sergeant Caleb Walker, and he was someone James had served with in Fallujah. When he walked into the courtroom, he paused at the door, eyes scanning the room, before his gaze fixed on James. "I'm here to clear the air," Sergeant Walker said, his voice deep and commanding. He had an air of authority that caused even the judge to raise an eyebrow. The courtroom once again fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the sergeant, unsure of what he might say next. Would he add to the chaos? Would he confirm the accusations? Or would he speak to James' defense? "I was there, in Fallujah," Sergeant Walker continued. "I saw what happened. And I'm telling you right now, James didn't make that call because he wanted to. He did it because it was the only way out. We were given an impossible choice. And James, like the rest of us, was forced to follow orders, no matter how much it tore him apart." The sergeant's words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the accusations that had been made. The tension in the room shifted again, as if the crowd now saw James as less of a villain and more as a man caught in the gears of a machine much larger than himself. Sergeant Walker moved forward, standing beside James' wheelchair. "You don't know the full story," he said, his voice now softer, directed toward the judge. "None of you do. But James, he did what any soldier would do in that situation. He survived, and we should be honoring him for that, not prosecuting him." The judge looked at the sergeant, his eyes narrowed, processing the information. He nodded slowly, as if weighing each word. "This is certainly a complicated case. We will need time to investigate further. The facts are unclear, and we must ensure that justice is served appropriately." The courtroom began to settle into a strange, uneasy calm. The judge's decision to pause the trial gave everyone a moment to breathe, but the questions remained. What would happen next? Would James be exonerated? Would the full truth of the operation ever come to light? As the day wound down, the crowd slowly filtered out of the courtroom, still processing everything they had just witnessed. But as for James, he was left in his wheelchair, surrounded by his few remaining defenders. The weight of his past was still heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the truth would set him free. And then, as everyone began to leave, James noticed something. There, standing at the back of the room, was a woman. She had been sitting quietly, watching the trial unfold without saying a word. But now, her eyes met James, and he felt something stir deep within him. Who was she? What was her connection to him? As their gazes locked, she gave a slight nod, as if to say she knew. She knew the full story. But what was her role in this unfolding drama? James wasn't sure, but he knew he had to find out. The answers were just beginning to unfold, and the next chapter of his life was about to begin. The courtroom had emptied, but James remained in his wheelchair, a silent observer of the chaos that had swirled around him just moments before. He felt the eyes of those who had left still on him, in some way, those whispers hanging in the air, questions that would never be answered, not yet. The events had left him feeling like an outsider in his own life, a man haunted by a past he hadn't wanted to face. As the last of the spectators filed out, James turned his attention back to the woman standing near the door. Her presence had been subtle, but now, as the room cleared, she stepped forward. She was older, though still youthful in the way her energy filled the room. She had long dark hair, pulled back into a neat ponytail, and was dressed in a simple coat that made her seem like someone who belonged to the shadows, not the courtroom. Yet, there was something undeniably familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. James' heart skipped a beat when their eyes met. It wasn't just her gaze. There was a recognition in her expression, something that made the air feel thicker. She approached slowly, her steps quiet but deliberate. When she reached him, she paused for a moment, studying him closely, as if waiting for something, perhaps a sign, or a response from him. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked softly, her voice steady, yet tinged with an emotion that James couldn't quite decipher. James blinked, his mind racing. The past felt like a maze that had been forgotten, with pieces that didn't fit together. He frowned, trying to find her face in his memories, but nothing clicked. She was a stranger, and yet, there was something about her that pulled at him, a deep, nagging familiarity. "No, I'm sorry," James said quietly, shaking his head. "Should I?" She gave a slight, almost sad smile. "I'm not surprised," she said, her voice low. "It's been a long time. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." James studied her more carefully, his brow furrowing in confusion. I don't know who you are." "I'm Maya Williams," she said, her name hanging in the air for a moment. When James didn't react, she added, "I was with you during that mission in Fallujah." James felt his heart stop for a moment. The name struck him like a thunderbolt, pulling him back to a time he had buried so deep. It felt like a lifetime ago. Maya. He remembered now. She was one of the medics. She had been one of the few who had stayed by his side through the chaos. But why was she here now? Why had she waited until this moment to come forward? "You were there?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You? How did you find me?" Maya's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "I've been looking for you for years, James. I know what you've been through, and I've been trying to reach you. After everything happened, we lost contact. But I never forgot you." The words she spoke sent a ripple of memories through James. The pain, the guilt, the confusion, all of it began to rush back. He saw her face, faintly, through the fog of war, but it was never clear enough to hold on to. He had tried to block it out, to forget the faces of the people he had once fought alongside, the ones who had witnessed the same horrors. "Why now?" James finally asked, his voice cracked, his throat tight. "Why after all these years?" Maya hesitated, her eyes shifting to the floor briefly before meeting his again. "Because I knew it wasn't your fault, James. What happened in Fallujah, it wasn't your decision to make alone. You're not the villain in this. I know that. And it's time for the world to understand the truth." The words felt like a balm to James' wounded soul, though he couldn't fully let go of the years of guilt that still clung to him. But what Maya said struck him deeply. She had never believed the stories that painted him as a monster. She knew the reality, the deeper truths of what had happened on that day. "I didn't want it to happen," James whispered. "I didn't want to make that call, but it was either that, or let us all die." Maya knelt down next to him, her eyes gentle but resolute. "You did what you had to do to survive, James. And I'm not the only one who knows that. There are others who remember the man you were, the man you still are." Her words, though comforting, didn't erase the years of shame that had built up in James' heart. He had been forced to live with the burden of that choice, carrying it with him like a chain. No matter what Maya said, no matter how many people spoke on his behalf, he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to forgive himself. But Maya's presence, her unwavering support, gave him something he hadn't had in a long time, a flicker of hope. She had come for him, not just to defend him, but to remind him of who he had been before the war, before everything had gone wrong. "I can't do this alone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't have to," Maya replied softly, her hand resting gently on his. "You've never been alone, James. Not really. You have people who care about you, people who will fight for you." As she spoke those words, something shifted within James. He had spent years believing that the world had forgotten him, that he had been left to rot on the streets, cast aside by everyone who once cared. But now, in the midst of everything that had been uncovered in the courtroom, he realized that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Maya was here. Calloway was here. And, somehow, there were others out there who understood the truth, who would fight to bring him justice. And yet, as much as his heart began to stir with the promise of redemption, he knew that the battle was far from over. The trial was still in motion, and there were forces at play, forces that wouldn't be swayed by truth alone. There were still powerful people who would stop at nothing to make sure the operation in Fallujah stayed buried. "We have to be careful," Maya added, her voice turning serious. "There are people who won't want this truth to come out, and they'll do anything to keep it hidden." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen the lengths to which people in power would go to protect their secrets. He had lived through it. And now, with the truth on the brink of being exposed, he knew that the fight for justice would be the hardest of his life. But Maya was right. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of determination. He wasn't going to let his past define him. Not this time. Together, with the support of those who knew the truth, James would stand tall. He would face whatever came next. And he would fight, not just for himself, but for the others who had been forgotten, buried under the weight of their own wars. But as the day wore on and the courtroom emptied, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something that would test him even more than the trial itself. Would they let him tell his story? Would the truth finally break free? Or was there something darker still lurking in the shadows? The answers, he knew, were just beginning to unfold. The air outside the courthouse was heavy, a damp chill settling over the city as the late afternoon sun struggled to break through the clouds. The weight of everything that had happened in the courtroom still hung over James, but now, with Maya by his side, he found himself walking out of the building in a way he hadn't done in years, slowly, cautiously, but with purpose. It felt strange, almost surreal, as if everything had shifted in the span of a few hours. As they made their way through the crowd outside, Maya walked beside him, her presence a steady anchor. She had told him she would stick by him, that they would face whatever came next together. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The courtroom revelations were only the beginning. The truth was powerful, but it also had a way of making people scared. And when people were scared, they often did things that no one could predict. "We need to find somewhere quiet," Maya said, her voice low, as they reached the street. "There's a lot to discuss. And it's not just about the trial anymore. There are people who are going to start looking for answers, and they won't stop until they get them." James nodded, though he wasn't sure where this would lead. He wasn't even sure where to go anymore. He had spent years on the streets, wandering, drifting from place to place, always moving to avoid the ghosts of his past. But now, with the trial looming and his past spilling out into the open, he knew he couldn't keep running. Not anymore. They found a small diner a few blocks from the courthouse, tucked away in a quiet corner. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of late lunchers nursing coffee at the counter. The low hum of conversation and the clink of silverware filled the space, creating an odd sense of normalcy, a stark contrast to the chaos James had just endured. Once they were seated, Maya ordered them both coffee, and James leaned back in the booth, his eyes staring out the window, lost in thought. The weight of his past was suffocating, but there was something else growing in the pit of his stomach. Fear. Fear of what was coming. Fear of what would happen next. Maya set a cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes studying him carefully. "You don't have to talk about it, James. I know it's hard, but we need to prepare for what's next. This is just the beginning, and we have a lot to figure out if we're going to keep you safe. You don't just have your past catching up with you, James. You have people with power who don't want this to get out. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure the truth stays buried." James took a long, slow sip of his coffee, his fingers trembling slightly as he set the cup down. The warmth from the mug contrasted with the chill that ran through him, but it didn't seem to help. He wanted to believe that the truth would set him free, but deep down, he knew the reality was more complicated. The world wasn't so forgiving. Not when it came to the powerful forces that lurked behind closed doors. Who's trying to stop the truth from coming out? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes locked onto Maya's, searching for answers, for reassurance that this wasn't all some horrible dream he couldn't wake up from. Maya leaned forward, her expression serious. There are a few people who won't let this go easily, James. The operation in Fallujah was classified for a reason. It involved too many sensitive elements, too many high-level people. If the full truth comes out, it's not just you they'll have to answer for. It's the people who issued the orders. And that means powerful politicians, military brass, maybe even people in the intelligence community. They've worked hard to cover this up, and they'll do anything to keep the details hidden. James swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He had known, deep down, that there was more to his past than just a simple mistake. But hearing Maya confirm it made the reality of the situation even more terrifying. The fight he was facing now wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about going up against a system that had its roots deep in the government. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to take on that kind of battle. Maya seemed to sense his fear, and she placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. You're not alone in this, James. We have people on our side. There are others who have been waiting for this moment too. People who've been following this story, people who know what really happened in Fallujah. They know the truth. The truth, James repeated, almost to himself. I never wanted anyone to know. I didn't want to face what I did. I was just trying to survive. Maya nodded. I know. But now the truth is out. And it's not just your truth, James. It's everyone's. There are people who lost everything because of that operation, families who had no idea what was happening until it was too late. They deserve to know what happened, just like you do. The only way to move forward is to fight for it. James leaned back, staring out the window again, his mind swirling. The people in power, the ones who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, were coming for him. He knew they would, and they wouldn't stop until they had silenced him, one way or another. But he couldn't keep running. He couldn't hide anymore. I'm scared, Maya, he admitted quietly, his voice raw with emotion. I don't know if I can do this. Maya's eyes softened, her voice filled with understanding. It's okay to be scared. We all are. But you don't have to face this alone. You have people who care about you, people who are going to stand by you. And we're going to fight this, together. As the conversation continued, James felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The road ahead was long, and there was no guarantee of what the outcome would be. But for the first time since the trial began, he believed there was a chance. He wasn't just a forgotten soldier. He wasn't just a homeless man left to rot in the streets. He was James Holloway, and he had a story to tell, a story that needed to be heard. But as Maya spoke about their next steps, about the people they needed to contact, the doors of the diner swung open, and a man stepped in, one who seemed out of place in the quiet atmosphere. He was tall, wearing a dark trench coat that gave him an almost menacing look. His gaze swept the room, then settled on James and Maya with a look of unmistakable intent. James tensed, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. There was something about the man that didn't sit right with him. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he knew exactly what he was walking into, and exactly who he was after. Maya noticed the shift in James' demeanor and looked up, her eyes narrowing. Stay calm, she whispered, her tone sharp. We don't know who he is yet, but he's here for a reason. The man's eyes locked with James for a moment. Then he walked toward their table. Each step seemed to echo in the quiet diner, a beat of tension rising with every footfall. Mr. Holloway, the man said smoothly as he stopped in front of their booth. I was hoping I could have a word with you. James' heart began to race, but he fought to keep his composure. Who are you? He asked, his voice steady but wary. The man smiled, a thin, almost too polite smile. My name is Thomas Layton. I work for certain people who have an interest in your case. He glanced over at Maya, his gaze hardening. And I think we need to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. James felt the air grow heavier, the sense of danger growing stronger. Who was this man, and what was he really after? What did he mean by certain people? James' instincts screamed that this conversation was about to take a turn he wasn't ready for. Maya's hand subtly shifted under the table, her fingers brushing against something in her coat pocket. something that made James feel slightly less afraid. "James," she said softly, her voice cold and clear. "Whatever happens, you don't have to say anything to him. We don't owe him anything." Leighton's smile didn't waver, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes now. "I think you'll change your mind soon enough. After all, you don't want to make things more difficult than they already are." And just like that, James knew the fight for his freedom, for the truth, had just taken a darker turn. The shadows were closing in, and they wouldn't stop until they had buried everything he had fought for. But James wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He had come too far to let them win. Now, the real battle was about to begin. The silence in the diner felt suffocating. James' eyes never left Thomas Leighton as the man stood there, his presence commanding, though his smile never quite reached his eyes. Maya's hand was still resting on something hidden in her coat, and James could sense the tension in the air as both of them prepared for what could be a confrontation. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Holloway," Leighton said again, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of something far darker. "I'd appreciate it if we could have a quiet conversation. I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm simply here to offer you a deal." James felt the pit in his stomach grow heavier. He had seen enough of these kinds of men in his life. People who spoke with calm voices, but whose eyes betrayed a willingness to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. He wasn't foolish enough to think Leighton was here with good intentions. Maya's voice broke the silence, low and firm. "We're not interested in any deal you're offering. Whatever you're selling, we don't need it." Leighton's smile faded just a little, but his composure didn't crack. "You misunderstand, Ms. Williams. I'm offering Mr. Holloway a chance to walk away from all of this, to leave the past behind and not have to deal with the fallout of the truth coming out. I'm sure he's tired of all this attention, all these eyes on him, just waiting to destroy his reputation, his life. I'm here to offer a way out." James' hand clenched around the coffee cup in front of him. "A way out," he echoed, his voice hardening. "What do you mean by that?" Leighton leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving James. "A simple proposition. You walk away from the trial, you stop talking about Fallujah, and everything goes away. No one will dig any deeper. No one will come after you. I'll make sure of that." Maya's grip on her hidden object tightened, and James could feel the temperature in the room drop. "And what's the catch, Leighton?" "There's always a catch," Maya said, her voice colder than before. "You want him to stay silent. You want him to bury the truth again." Leighton's lips twitched into a smile. "You're a smart woman, Ms. Williams." "Yes, that's exactly it. Mr. Holloway can have peace. He can live the rest of his life free of this nightmare. All he has to do is stop the trial, walk away, and never speak of Fallujah again." James' mind raced. He could hear the sound of his heart pounding in his ears as he processed Leighton's words. A chance to walk away from the past, from everything that had dragged him into the light. A chance to be left alone, free from the constant reminders of what he had done and the choices he had made. It was tempting, more tempting than anything he'd been offered in years. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. "And if I don't?" James asked, his voice more composed now. "What happens if I don't take your deal?" Leighton's smile faded entirely, replaced by something much colder. "If you don't, Mr. Holloway, well, let's just say your troubles won't end with the trial. You'll have more eyes on you than you could ever imagine. People from your past, people who would prefer the truth to remain hidden, will make sure you regret refusing." The threat was clear now. There was no subtlety left in his words. Leighton wasn't offering peace. He was offering silence, and a way to escape the storm, but only at the cost of his soul. James' hands shook, but his grip tightened on the coffee cup. He had lived too long in the shadows, had fought to survive for too many years, to give up now. The truth mattered. The lives that had been lost because of that operation mattered. He couldn't let them all be forgotten, just for the promise of an easier life. He set the cup down with a firm clink. "I won't be silenced," James said, his voice steady, though the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest. "I can't. The truth has to come out. People need to know what happened, what I went through, what we all went through." Leighton's eyes narrowed, the smile gone completely. "You're making a mistake, Holloway. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone who's been involved in this operation. You think you're fighting for some noble cause? You're playing a dangerous game." James met Leighton's gaze without flinching. "I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm not running anymore. Not from the truth." Leighton's expression darkened, and he straightened up, You're a fool then, he said coldly. The offer will still stand, Holloway. But don't say I didn't warn you. Without another word, Leighton turned and walked out of the diner, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, leaving James and Maya alone once more. The door swung shut with a soft click, and the tension in the room seemed to dissipate slightly, though a lingering unease remained. Maya let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. That guy's trouble, James. You're not wrong to stand your ground, but be careful. They won't just back off. And if they're willing to make threats like that, it means they've got something else planned. James nodded, still feeling the weight of Leighton's words pressing down on him. The man had been trying to buy his silence, and it hadn't worked. But now James had a bigger problem. He wasn't just fighting the legal system. He was fighting a group of people who had the power to destroy him if they wanted to. People who weren't afraid to make threats, to go to any lengths to bury the truth. I know, James said, his voice low. But I can't give in to them. I can't let them win. I have to see this through. Maya studied him for a moment before nodding. I'm with you. But we need to stay one step ahead. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everything that happened back in Fallujah. We have to make sure we have the right allies in place, or they'll crush us before we even get to the truth. The weight of their next steps loomed over them, but for the first time in a long while, James felt a fire inside him. It wasn't just about fighting for his freedom. It was about fighting for those who had been silenced, for the families whose lives had been shattered, for the soldiers who had been told to carry out an order without ever knowing the cost. He had started this journey as a broken man, discarded and forgotten. But now he was something more. He was a man with a purpose, a man who wasn't going to stop until the truth was heard. But just as James was about to speak, a sudden crash sounded outside the diner. It was sharp, startling, and the ground seemed to shake beneath them. James' heart skipped a beat, and his instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Maya's eyes darted to the door, her expression turning into one of worry. Stay down, she whispered, her voice tense. Whatever happens, don't make a scene. Stay quiet. James' pulse quickened. He didn't know what was happening, but the sense of danger was palpable. It was clear now. The fight for the truth wasn't just about a courtroom anymore. It had become something bigger, and someone, or something, was about to make sure he never got the chance to finish it. The sound of the crash outside sent a jolt of panic through James. His heart raced, and his body tensed, muscles tightening in instinctive preparation. The once quiet diner now felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in and the threat outside was drawing nearer. Maya's warning echoed in his mind, her eyes darting to the door as she rose from her seat, positioning herself closer to James. Stay down, James, Maya repeated, her voice urgent, as she subtly reached into her coat pocket. Her movements were swift, calculated. James' breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel the danger closing in, wrapping around him like a noose. A second crash echoed louder this time, followed by a series of rapid, muffled voices. It was impossible to make out the words, but it sounded like chaos, like something had broken through. The hair on the back of James' neck stood on end, and he instinctively pulled his wheelchair backward, hoping to find cover, though the cramped diner offered little. Don't look now, Maya whispered, her voice steady but laced with tension. But we're not alone anymore. James' pulse hammered in his ears as his eyes flicked to the door. From his vantage point, he could just make out the silhouette of several figures through the frosted glass. They were moving fast, their shadows large and imposing, and it wasn't long before the door handle turned, creaking with the sound of impending danger. Without warning, the door swung open. A man in a black tactical suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the diner quickly before landing on James and Maya. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard face that betrayed no emotion. His presence alone made the air feel heavier. Maya Williams, the man said, his voice a low growl, as his eyes briefly shifted to her. And James Holloway, you've been a lot of trouble, haven't you? James' instincts kicked in. He didn't need to be told twice. This man was not here for a friendly chat. Maya, however, stood her ground, her hands still concealed in her coat pocket, her posture unwavering. We didn't ask for any trouble, Maya said, her voice cold and controlled. But you seem to be bringing it to us. The man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving them. You don't get to refuse an invitation, Ms. Williams, he said, his tone ice cold. The powers that be don't like it when people like you stir the pot. And Mr. Holloway? You think you're some hero now? Let me tell you something. You're nothing but a pawn. You've made a lot of noise, but you're about to get the message. The words hit James like a slap in the face, and his grip tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. He wasn't sure who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was painfully clear. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a warning. Maya shifted slightly, but her eyes never left the man. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now. "And what do you want with us?" The man's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "You're not in a position to ask questions, Ms. Williams. You're here because you need to understand the consequences of what you're doing. You've chosen the wrong side. There's no going back from this." Before James could react, another figure appeared in the doorway, a second man, equally imposing, wearing the same black tactical gear. This one had a different energy about him, more calculated, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Is there a problem here, Jenkins?" the new man asked, his voice smooth, but with an unmistakable authority. The first man, Jenkins, straightened up and nodded, never taking his eyes off Maya and James. "No problem yet, but there will be if they don't cooperate." James' heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced. They were being threatened, and the more they refused to back down, the more the danger grew. These men weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to make a point. The power these figures held was something James had never encountered before. He had fought in wars, faced gunfire, and seen death up close. But this was different. Maya, however, didn't flinch. "We're not interested in your threats," she said coldly. "If you've come to intimidate us into silence, you're wasting your time." James has already made his choice. The second man, Jenkins' partner, eyed Maya and James for a moment, considering her words. He then exchanged a glance with Jenkins, who gave a barely perceptible nod. The tension in the room thickened with every second. "You don't get it, do you?" the second man said, his voice dropping lower. "This isn't about threats. This is about control. And the truth? It's something you don't get to decide. People like you, people who think they can go against the system, are a liability. We don't care about your moral high ground. We care about making sure the right people stay in power. And people like James Holloway? You're a loose end." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. These men were not just hired muscle. They were part of something much larger. Their language, their intent, everything pointed to a dangerous network of influence. A network he had unwittingly become a part of by speaking out. He knew that if he didn't act now, this would escalate into something far worse. "We're not afraid of you," Maya said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You're the ones who should be scared. Because once the truth is out, there's no going back. And you'll be the ones who are exposed." The second man, who hadn't spoken much until now, seemed to take offense at her words. His eyes darkened, his expression twisting into something resembling anger. But before he could respond, there was a loud crash from the back of the diner, followed by hurried footsteps. In an instant, everyone turned toward the noise. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a new figure appeared, someone James hadn't seen in years, but who he recognized immediately. It was Sergeant Caleb Walker, the man who had fought by his side in Fallujah. Caleb's eyes locked with James for a brief moment, and there was no hesitation in his actions. He moved quickly, taking control of the situation as he pulled out a gun from beneath his jacket, pointing it directly at the two men in black. "Back off," Caleb said, his voice low but filled with authority. "You don't want to do this." James felt a surge of relief and confusion, his heart still racing. Caleb was here, why? What had he walked into? But there was no time to process it. The situation had just escalated to a whole new level. The two men in black exchanged a quick look. Jenkins' face twisted in irritation, but he didn't move. The tension was unbearable as both sides locked eyes, the room thick with the promise of violence. "Now, we're in a real mess," the second man finally spoke, his gaze never leaving Caleb's gun. "But let's make one thing clear. This doesn't end well for any of you." Caleb didn't flinch. "You're wrong," he said coldly. "It ends now." With that, the standoff began, and James realized, with a heavy heart, that things were spiraling out of control. What had started as a fight for truth was now a fight for survival. And everything they thought they knew was about to be tested. The standoff in the diner was surreal. James could hardly breathe, his heart hammering against his chest as he stared at Caleb Walker, the man who had once fought beside him in Fallujah, the soldier who had been a part of the same operation that had haunted James every step for years. And now, Caleb was standing between James and these two dangerous men, his gun raised and steady, a silent promise of protection. The two men in black, Jenkins and his partner, exchanged a brief, silent glance. It was clear that they weren't used to being threatened, not like this. They had the power, the control, the resources. They were the ones who were supposed to make people back down. But Caleb, with his hardened face and steady hands, was making them hesitate. "You don't want to make this worse," Caleb said, his voice low and almost serene. His eyes never wavered from the two men. "There's a lot more at play here than you realize." Jenkins gritted his teeth, his expression hardening. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone like Caleb. But the gun in Caleb's hands was enough to give him pause. "You're making a mistake, soldier," Jenkins growled, his eyes flicking between Caleb and Maya. "This isn't a fight you're going to win." "I'm not here to win," Caleb replied evenly. "I'm here to make sure you don't leave this diner with your lives intact if you think you can threaten people who don't deserve it." The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. The world outside the diner seemed to have frozen as the three men stared each other down. Maya, still seated beside James, was rigid with concentration, her hand hidden beneath her coat, ready for anything. James, too, found himself frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. His mind was racing. Everything had shifted in the span of mere minutes. The other man, Caleb's counterpart, finally spoke. "This is your last warning," he said coldly, eyeing Caleb's weapon with barely concealed contempt. "We don't need to be here for this. We were just following orders." Caleb scoffed. "That's always the excuse, isn't it? Just following orders. Well, I don't answer to you, and neither does anyone else here. If you really want to make this a fight, I'll make sure you won't have the chance to walk out the door." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the standoff between the two sides growing heavier. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, until suddenly, the man who had been speaking to Caleb, his partner, took a small step back, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. Caleb's eyes flicked to the movement immediately, his finger tightening on the trigger in response. The temperature in the room dropped even further. "I suggest you put your hand where I can see it," Caleb warned, his voice unwavering. The man froze, his eyes narrowing. The situation had escalated, but before anyone could react further, the sound of a car engine roaring to life outside caused everyone to turn toward the window. A car screeched to a halt just outside the diner, tires slamming against the pavement. The noise was so sudden, so unexpected, that everyone in the room looked toward the door in unison. Then, the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked echoed through the air. The door slammed open with a bang, and in stepped a third figure, this one taller and broader than the two men in black. He was wearing a dark jacket, his hair shaved close to his head, and his face was a sharp combination of determination and rage. In his hand, he gripped a shotgun, its barrel aimed directly at Jenkins and his partner. Well, the newcomer said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I didn't think it would be this easy to find you guys." Jenkins and his partner both whipped their heads around, shock evident on their faces. The man in the doorway hadn't just arrived by coincidence. He was here for a reason, and that reason was clear the moment they laid eyes on him. "Who the hell are you?" Jenkins barked, his earlier bravado gone. The newcomer chuckled darkly, stepping fully into the diner. "The name's Russell Price," he said with a grin, "and I'm here to make sure you leave in a lot worse shape than you came in." Caleb's eyes narrowed, a mixture of caution and surprise flickering across his face. "You know these guys?" he asked, his gun still trained on Jenkins. Russell glanced at Caleb briefly, then turned his gaze back to the two men. "I don't know them, but I know their type. They're the ones who think they can come in and start throwing their weight around. Well, that's not going to fly today. Not in my town." Maya watched all of this with a mix of confusion and wariness. Another player had entered the game, and she wasn't sure whether it was an advantage or a complication. But as the standoff continued, she knew one thing for sure. It was no longer just about James. The stakes were much higher, and the forces behind the scenes were growing more dangerous by the minute. The tension in the diner was unbearable as the four men faced off. James, still unsure of how to respond to this new development, glanced at Maya. She met his gaze and nodded, a silent signal of understanding. They weren't alone anymore. But that didn't mean they were safe. "You don't have to do this, Price," Jenkins said, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Russell didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. You're not going to intimidate anyone here. And if you want to try, well, I'm happy to oblige." The two men in black exchanged a glance, weighing their options. In that moment, they both seemed to realize something. Their window for negotiation had closed. They had underestimated the situation, underestimated the people they were dealing with. Jenkins took a slow, deliberate step back, signaling his partner to do the same. The air was thick with the possibility of violence, but the tension cracked when Jenkins spoke again, his voice dark with threat. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think this is your victory? Think again. We'll be back. And next time, you won't have this much luck." Russell grinned. "I'll be waiting," he said, his tone dismissive. And just like that, Jenkins and his partner turned, their steps heavy and reluctant as they made their way toward the door. The moment they stepped outside, they vanished into the night. The door swung closed with a finality that echoed in the quiet diner. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, Russell slowly lowered the shotgun, his posture relaxing, but his eyes still watchful. He turned to face James and Maya, his grin never leaving his face. "You two are lucky I showed up when I did," Russell said, his voice lighter now, though still filled with an edge. "But I'm guessing you're not exactly surprised to see me." Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting between suspicion and gratitude. "Surprised? No, but I didn't expect you to be so dramatic." Russell chuckled, holstering his shotgun and walking toward the booth. "Dramatic? I don't know what you're talking about. I just don't like bullies." James felt the weight of the night begin to lift just a little. His pulse was still racing, his hands clammy, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. For now, at least. But Russell's presence raised even more questions. Who was he? Why had he stepped in when he did? And how was he connected to all of this? Before James could ask, Russell answered his unspoken question. "I've been watching this mess unfold," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "I'm not on your side exactly, but I know what those guys are capable of. They're bad news. And I'm here because you might need some help getting out of this alive." James leaned back, taking in Russell's words. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, thick with implications. Russell Price, a man who had just saved their lives, wasn't here out of the kindness of his heart. No, there was something more to his involvement, something deeper that James couldn't yet grasp. Russell leaned against the counter, casually wiping his hands on a cloth as though the gunfight moments earlier hadn't just happened. Maya's eyes never left him, studying him with careful suspicion. She knew something wasn't right. James could see the wariness in her posture, in the way her fingers danced under the table as if readying herself for anything. Russell finally broke the silence. "Look, I know this probably looks like I'm some kind of savior out of nowhere. But trust me, I've been keeping my eye on you two for a while now. I don't do this kind of thing for just anyone." Maya tilted her head, still wary. "You've been watching us? How long?" Russell gave her a slow, almost amused look. "Long enough to know that things were going to get ugly. You two have made a lot of noise lately, and when people make noise, they attract attention. Some of that attention isn't friendly." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't realized just how much of his life was being monitored. He had known that the operation in Fallujah was classified, that it had been buried by those in power, but he hadn't considered the far-reaching consequences. Now, it was clear, his past was unraveling in ways he couldn't control. "You're saying you've been tracking us for a while?" James asked, his voice hardening slightly. He wasn't sure if he liked the idea of someone monitoring him without his knowledge, but there was something about Russell's demeanor that made him hold back on the barrage of questions. Russell didn't seem put off by James' skepticism. Instead, he shrugged. "You could say that. I've been watching your trial, keeping tabs on the people pulling the strings behind the scenes. When you and Maya started pushing back, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone decided to silence you. And trust me, those someones don't play nice." Maya's eyes narrowed. "So why now? Why step in?" Russell's smile flickered, a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Because I like chaos. But more importantly, I don't like it when people who have the power to change things get crushed under the weight of secrets. You've got a lot of people worried, Holloway, and that makes you useful to certain parties. If you don't want to end up like everyone else who tried to take on the system, you'll need someone who knows how to navigate the mess. James tried to process Russell's words. It was all too much too fast. He had always lived his life one day at a time, doing whatever he could to survive. But now, as the truth about Fallujah continued to surface, he was becoming aware that his fight for justice was entangled with far larger forces. Forces he had no real understanding of. Maya spoke again, her voice now laced with suspicion. So you want us to trust you, after everything? You expect us to believe that you're here to help us for nothing in return. Russell chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. I don't expect anything. But you're right to be cautious. I'm not here to play the knight in shining armor. I have my own interests, and I'm not stupid enough to throw them away. But in this mess, we need to work together. James felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He wasn't ready to trust Russell, but he couldn't deny the man had been the one to save them from a dangerous situation. The men in black had been ready to escalate things beyond just threats. Things could have turned deadly in an instant. You said we need to work together, James said slowly. What does that mean? What do you need from us? Russell's eyes softened just slightly, as if the question had piqued his interest. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. I've been keeping track of the people behind all this, people who would rather the truth stay buried. I've got enough information to make a move, but I'm not going to lie to you. It's dangerous, and I'm not taking you down this path unless you're prepared for the consequences. Maya shifted in her seat, clearly thinking over Russell's words. What kind of consequences? Russell met her gaze, unflinching. The kind where you might lose more than you bargained for. People with power don't like being exposed, and they'll do anything to stop you. But there's a bigger game at play here, and it's not just about your trial, James. It's about everything that led to Fallujah and everything that came after. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. James felt his mind spin with questions, things he didn't know, things he couldn't have anticipated. The situation had escalated beyond a courtroom drama. Now, he was embroiled in a web of conspiracy, power, and hidden agendas. The men in black were just the surface. The truth was deeper, darker, and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. So what do you want from us? Maya asked, her voice colder now. What's your endgame, Russell? Russell paused, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, after a long moment of contemplation, he spoke. I want you to take down the people who think they're untouchable, he said, his voice resolute. I want you to make them regret every decision they made to cover up the truth about what happened in Fallujah. But to do that, you need more than just a court case. You need information. You need allies. And most of all, you need to stay alive long enough to expose everything. James felt the gravity of Russell's words sink in. He had always known that exposing the truth would be dangerous. But hearing it laid out so bluntly, hearing the stakes spelled out so clearly, made him realize just how much he was up against. We'll need more than just a fight, Maya said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. We'll need resources. We'll need protection. And above all, we'll need to stay one step ahead of everyone who wants to silence us. Russell smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the smile of a man who understood exactly what they were up against. Lucky for you, Russell said, his voice lowering. I have both. James looked at Maya, seeing the same doubts, the same questions reflected in her eyes. They were in this together, for better or worse. But whether Russell was truly an ally or another player in this dangerous game remained to be seen. As the din of the diner buzzed around them, James knew one thing for certain. Their battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of power and deception. And James Holloway was determined to see it rise to the surface, no matter what it cost. But as they left the diner, with Russell leading the way into the unknown, James couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was waiting for them, something that could change everything. And when it came, it would come fast. The night air was cool against James' skin as he, Maya, and Russell stepped out of the diner and into the darkened streets. The events inside had shifted everything. What started as a fight for justice had now morphed into a tangled web of conspiracy, corruption, and dangerous power players. James had never imagined his quest for the truth would draw him into something this big. And yet, here he was, standing in the midst of it, with no clear way out. Russell led them down the street toward a nondescript black car parked by the curb, the headlights reflecting off the wet pavement from a recent rain. He moved with purpose, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. Maya followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the area, always alert. James stayed close, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened in the diner. He couldn't shake the image of the men in black, their threats, their power, and how easily they had walked into his life. "What happens now?" James asked, his voice low as he caught up with Russell. Russell didn't look back at him, but his voice was calm, measured. "We get out of here, find somewhere safe, and plan our next move. We can't keep talking about this out in the open. There are too many years." James nodded, understanding the gravity of Russell's words. The enemy they were facing was far-reaching. He had been just a soldier in a forgotten war, until now. Now, he was the one people were worried about, and it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the truth of what had happened in Fallujah and the people who wanted to keep it buried. Russell opened the car door and gestured for them to get in. As they slid into the back seat, Russell's hand hovered near the steering wheel for a moment before he turned to face them, his eyes narrowed. "We're being watched," he said, his voice dark and cautious. "We can't afford to make any mistakes now. The moment we leave this car, the clock starts ticking. You have to be prepared for anything." James could feel the weight of his words. The trial, the hidden truths, the dangerous people hunting them. It was all beginning to feel like a tangled nightmare with no way out. His mind drifted back to the conversation with Leighton in the diner and the threat hanging in the air. He knew that they wouldn't let him go easily. They were coming for him, and for Maya, and possibly even for Russell too. "How are we supposed to stay ahead of them?" Maya asked, her voice sharp. She hadn't let her guard down for a second, and James admired her for that. "We have no idea how deep this goes. For all we know, there are more people working against us than we can count." Russell's gaze flicked to her through the rearview mirror, his lips twisting into a thin smile. "You're right. It's bigger than just you two. But I've got the resources to make sure you stay alive long enough to expose the truth. We have contacts, people who've been waiting for a moment like this. But we have to be careful. We can't trust anyone who's been too close to the powers behind this. People with connections." James frowned, glancing at Maya. "You mean people like Leighton?" Russell's eyes hardened. "Exactly. Leighton was trying to buy your silence. That's how they work. They use fear, money, power, whatever they can to make sure you shut up. But you didn't take their deal, and that makes you a target." James felt his gut tighten at Russell's words. He hadn't just been a soldier on the battlefield. Now, he was a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. The pieces were moving, and he was running out of time to figure out the rules. "How do we even start?" James asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Where do we go from here?" Russell paused for a moment before responding. "First, we lay low. We don't make any public moves. We have to keep our heads down while we gather more information. I've got a contact who's been tracking the people behind the operation. He can help us get a deeper look into what they've been covering up. But getting to him won't be easy." Maya leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean getting to him won't be easy? Who are we talking about?" Russell looked at her in the rearview mirror, his gaze inscrutable. "His name's Alex Devereaux. He used to be with the CIA, but he's been off the grid for a while. He's the kind of guy who knows how to dig up dirt without anyone noticing. If anyone knows the full story of what happened in Fallujah, it's him." "CIA?" Maya repeated, sounding skeptical. "How do we know we can trust him?" Russell's expression darkened. "We don't. But we don't have a choice. The people we're up against, those powerful forces, are experts at covering their tracks. We need someone like Devereaux to dig up the evidence we need." The weight of his words hit James hard. They were diving into a world of espionage, government secrets, and people who were capable of doing anything to protect their own interests. The world had always been dangerous for James, but now, it felt as though everything he had ever known had been pulled out from under him. "We'll meet Devereaux tomorrow," Russell continued, breaking James out of his thoughts. "But tonight, we get some rest. I know this has been a hell of a day for you, but you need to stay sharp. If you're serious about exposing the truth, you need to be ready for whatever comes next." The car's engine roared to life, and Russell maneuvered it into the street, weaving through the city's darkened streets. James felt the familiar thrum of the road beneath him, but his mind was far from at ease. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear: This wasn't going to be an easy fight. They arrived at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript place that seemed like the perfect place to lay low. Russell led them up a flight of stairs and into a modest apartment on the second floor. The place was sparsely furnished, but it had everything they needed: a bed, a small table, and enough security to keep them off the radar. As they settled in, James sat on the edge of the bed, his head spinning. The weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours felt suffocating. He had gone from being a forgotten man, discarded by society, to someone caught in the middle of a game he didn't understand. Maya sat beside him, her face solemn as she glanced at him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. James sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know. It feels like everything's falling apart." Maya didn't respond immediately, but she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steadying. "We'll get through this," she said quietly. "We have to." The room fell silent for a long moment. James wanted to believe her, to believe that they could still win this. But as he thought about what lay ahead, Devereaux, the people watching them, the dangerous game they were playing, he knew it was going to take everything they had. The truth wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was their only way out. And if they didn't play their cards right, they would be swallowed by the same forces they were trying to expose. The night stretched on, and as James lay back in bed, his thoughts churned. Tomorrow was a new day, but the real battle had only just begun. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the apartment as James awoke to the reality of what lay ahead. The events of the previous night felt like a blur of adrenaline and danger, but the truth had not changed. They had come too far, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Maya was already awake, sitting at the small table with a cup of coffee, her brow furrowed as she scanned through a stack of papers. She looked up when she heard him stir, her eyes steady, unyielding. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice determined. "If we're going to meet Devereaux, we need to make sure we're not being followed. We can't afford any mistakes today." James sat up slowly, his body aching from the stress of the last few days. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been stretched too thin, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't the man he had been when he'd first been thrust into this fight. Now, there was no turning back. "What's the plan?" he asked, running a hand through his hair. Maya stood and walked over to the window, peering through the blinds before turning back to him. "We meet Devereaux at a secure location, get what we need, and then we make our next move. But we have to be careful. Devereaux won't trust us right away. He's been off the grid for a reason." James nodded, his thoughts focused. "So, we get him to talk, get the information we need to expose everything?" "Exactly," Maya replied. "We get the full story. The people who covered up Fallujah, the ones who put you in this position, they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. But we have one thing they don't." James met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. "The truth. Right?" Maya said softly. "And that's more powerful than anything they've got." They spent the next few hours preparing, gathering the necessary supplies, and securing their route. Russell had been tight-lipped about the specifics of their meeting with Devereaux, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was preparing them for the worst and hoping for the best. By midday, they were on the move. Russell drove them through the city's back streets, staying off the main roads. Every turn, every stop, felt like a calculated move. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but the only thing that mattered was the meeting ahead. After a tense drive, they arrived at a small, unmarked building on the edge of the city. Russell glanced over at James and Maya, his eyes hard with resolve. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "Stay sharp. If Devereaux has agreed to meet, we don't know who else could be involved." James nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The truth, which had felt so far out of reach, was now within their grasp. But it was fragile, too fragile to be handled recklessly. They entered the building, a former office space now converted into something more discreet. The place was dimly lit, with metal shelves stacked high with old files and documents. In the far corner, a man sat at a desk, his back to them. The air was thick with tension, and James felt his pulse quicken. "Devereaux," Maya called softly, her voice echoing slightly in the space. The man turned slowly, his face hidden in the shadows for a moment before the light caught his sharp features. He was older than James remembered, graying hair at his temples and a rough, weathered face that spoke of years spent in the shadows. You must be Maya, Devereaux said, his voice low and raspy. He turned his gaze to James, his eyes cold, calculating. And you're the one they've been talking about. James couldn't tell if it was suspicion or curiosity that filled Devereaux's eyes. He had the aura of someone who had seen it all, the kind of man who had made deals with powers far darker than anything James could comprehend. But he wasn't here to judge. He was here for answers. We need your help, Maya said, cutting straight to the point. We're going to expose what happened in Fallujah. We have the truth, but we need your information to finish it. Devereaux leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface of the desk. And what makes you think I'm going to help you? What's in it for me? James stepped forward, his voice steady. The truth is bigger than any of us. It's not just about me. It's about all the people who were affected. The families who lost everything because of a decision that wasn't theirs to make. Devereaux's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. He didn't speak right away, but James could see the calculation in his eyes. The man was deciding whether or not they were worth the risk. Finally, Devereaux spoke. You think the truth is going to set you free? That's what everyone thinks. But the truth doesn't always come with a happy ending. Sometimes, it just leads to more bloodshed. We know the risks, Maya said. But we're willing to take them. We don't have a choice. Devereaux sighed, pushing back from the desk. He rubbed his temples as though trying to stave off a headache. Fine, he muttered. I'll help you. But know this, you're playing with fire. Once we start pulling on these threads, there's no telling how far they go. And when the people behind this come for you, you won't just have enemies in the shadows. You'll have enemies in the open. People who will stop at nothing. James felt his stomach churn at the implications, but he didn't back down. This was the moment. This was the step that would bring the truth into the light. Devereaux stood up, walking over to a filing cabinet and pulling out a folder. He handed it to Maya, who took it cautiously. As she flipped through the papers inside, a sense of finality hung in the air. The documents inside would be the key to exposing the operation, to unraveling the web of lies. James felt a rush of emotion. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a step closer, a step towards something that had seemed impossible. He was no longer just fighting for his own redemption. He was fighting for those who had been lost, for the families who had been forgotten. But Devereaux's words stuck with him. The truth was a weapon, a powerful one. But weapons could be dangerous, and the people who had spent years covering up the truth were not going to let it go quietly. Thank you, James said quietly, his voice thick with resolve. Devereaux nodded without saying another word. His part in this was done. He had given them the tools they needed, and now, the rest was up to them. As James, Maya, and Russell left the building, they didn't speak. The weight of what they had just received settled heavily on their shoulders. They were heading into dangerous territory, with enemies who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But the truth was on their side. And that, James knew, was the one thing they couldn't take from him. As they drove off into the night, James felt the first glimmer of hope in what had felt like an endless war. This was far from over, but they were ready. The fight for justice had only just begun, and he wouldn't stop. He couldn't, until the truth was exposed. The world needed to know, and James Holloway would make sure they did. The end was not yet written.